power, keeping essentialism at bay, and then species rules and meaning, and cataloging power, delineating competent naturalists and the meaning of species. Gordon is also the past director of Situating Science, which is a SSHRC National Strategic Knowledge Cluster. So his talk tonight will be on brewing civilization, the science and culture of beer. And I just want to remind everyone to please put your microphones off. We'll see how the connection goes. You can, if you could switch your camera off, that would be great for this portion. And when we open up to questions, you can turn them on again. And if you have any questions, feel free to save them for the end, or you can type your question in the chat and I will ask the question on your behalf at the end of the talk. So we're going to hand over to Gordon. Welcome again to the NSIS, and we look forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
Great, thanks. And thanks for getting the name pronunciation. Nobody does it, but it's great to hear it. I'm going to try to share my screen here to show you some slides along with this. Is that showing up okay?
It is.
Okay, I'm going to get rid of this bar across the bottom here so that I can see what I'm actually looking at. And just a minor correction on the poster on my biography. I should have noted this, and especially when I see the illustrious Eric Mills in our audience, illustrious member of our the NSIS, and of course it's Eric Mills and I are the founding co-directors of the History of Science and Technology program at King's College. So shout out to Eric. I hope you have some good questions and don't demolish me at the end of the yes, brewing science, history, culture, and science of beer. I've given a version of this before in the well, in a couple of breweries in Halifax. It's a pity that we can't do that here. But none of you have the excuse of the weather not to be at this thing. So at least that's one benefit. I did found, not the History of Science and Technology program alone, but I did found a very popular class at the University of King's College and at Dalhousie on this very topic, the brewing civilization, the history and culture of beer. Now called, it was called Brewing Science in the original version, but now it's called Brewing Civilization because science is a part of civilization. And I just can brag that that class was dubbed by the Huffington Post as the coolest class in Canada, as you can see here. And it was also announced in the New York Times as the coolest class in North America. Now, I don't teach it anymore. We teach it in the summer, and you are certainly welcome to take it. It's still offered by one of my colleagues as an audit credit. You can take the class, or you can show up and pay the whole shebang, and it's a great fun class. I'm going to draw on some of the key highlights of that class, but concentrate, because this is NSIS, on beer and science. So it's not just the science of beer, which we'll see here. If any of you are chemists, you'll recognize this right away. But there is a class over in the Department of Engineering at Dalhousie that's called Brewing Science. They stole my name, and they concentrate on the actual science behind the beer. I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between beer and science and beer and civilization. And it might be a bit of a surprise to some of you, the major contribution of beer and brewing to the development of science. And the things that I might cover today, it depends how much time we have, the move from alchemy to chemistry, the Industrial Revolution and the laws of thermodynamics actually comes out of brewing and beer. The origin of life and modern genetics has its origin in beer. And I'll even make the case at the very end that maybe quantum mechanics itself comes out of beer. Now, that's no mean feat. But I'm also going to talk about the relationship of beer to civilization. and the birth of so-called civilization, the relationships between gender and the rise of the public sphere, the notion of the modern state, and big science, all can be traced back to developments in brewing and brewing science. And not merely in an ad hoc manner. It actually turns out that it is brewing and beer that actually unfold into these developments of civilization. So this is not going to be, it's a short lecture, 45 minutes, but we'll see how far we get into this. And I hope at the end, you'll come away believing that beer and brewing is the most important contribution to modern civilization and modern science. And you come away with a greater appreciation for the craft and the quaft of beer when you're downing a couple of cold ones whenever the pubs open up again, which might be in about 42 years. So let's look at the very birth of beer and civilization. Okay, all cultures brew some sort of beer. It's a natural fermentation process, leaving grains, mulch into the open, and voila, we get fermentation. This is a woman brewing beer in Africa. There's a big dispute now in South Africa about preserving the traditional methods of brewing beer against the large industrial firms, and I'll talk a bit about that in the latter part of this lecture. There's if you go into North America and South America, we see indigenous cultures had brewed liquor and beer up before the encounter of the colonialists from Europe. Here's a Peruvian beer. My students in my brewing civilization class have an assignment to recreate some of the beers in past history. And a couple of years ago, some of them recreated this Peruvian beer, which requires an older woman like that to spit in it to start the brewing process. And they made it and we tested it, and it was really disgusting. It tastes like a combination of porridge and vomit. Our first recorded work of literature, in any form of literature, as some of you that have taken classics will know, is the Epic of Gilgamesh from about 2100 BC on Mesopotamian tablets. Their first recorded work of literature. And it sets the scene of Enkidu, who was stupid, ignorant, and hairy, maybe Scottish, and uncivilized. And he encounters the harlot, who spoke and said, "Eat the food and drink the beer, the destiny of the land." And so Enkidu drinks the beer, 7 whole jars of it, as you'll see down this stanza, and he becomes civilized and puts on clothes. Now, this particular myth it engages in a recent debate in archaeological circles about the very origins of civilization and the transference or the evolution from hunter-gatherer societies to ones centered around agriculture. With the birth of cities and cultural institutions and social hierarchies, etc., that one encounters in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, where so-called civilization has its origin. Now, it has been recently noted by anthropologists and archaeologists that hunter-gatherer societies actually had plenty of food to survive, and lots of leisure time, and pretty good health. So there's not any good food reasons for the development of agriculture. So why the shift to agriculture, which is risky and subject to shortages and famine and sedentary life like we're leading now, and disease of civilization? Many of our diseases actually are caused by our proximity of civilization. Well, it turns out the anthropological consensus is fast converging that agriculture was created to grow grains for fermentation, that is, to create alcoholic beverages, most likely beer. So huge swaths of land devoted to circulation of domestic crops in order to create grains for fermentation for drink, and then the agriculture like breads and all that is a spin-off of that. And we can recognize that in the first written records in Mesopotamia, and that is records of beer making, the description of making beer. And the hieroglyphics of ancient Egypt are rife with images of beer making and consumption. This is a common trope that we see on this image here of beer drinking out of the vat, and that's how they did it, through that long angular straw there. And there's acres and acres of these images from ancient Egypt of beer consumption and making. And we see it across civilizations, the lambic style of natural fermentation. Now, we should note that the only place where we see resistance to this notion of beer as being the origin of civilization is in ancient Greece and Rome. They were wine drinkers, wine made by slaves, and they identified beer and brewing with the barbarians, the others at the gates. And that should tell you, therefore, the Greeks and Romans are wrong, and we should resist claiming them as the birth of civilization, by the way. It's others that were drinking beer. Now, how is beer made in these civilizations? Although we have recipes, or some recipes from Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, and some of my students have tried to recreate these beers, actually, they're very rarely written down. And why is that the case? Well, it's because beer making was essentially a craft knowledge brought down through tradition and gestural activity, learning by hand, by craft, and pointedly through the female brewer. This is part of what a kind of an employment activity predominantly taken up by women. And throughout the medieval period, beer is made in the domestic home by women, which are called brewsters, using their own tacit knowledge of what was just right, the right amounts of ingredients, the right sort of feel, the right consistency, and they pass this down as what sociologists of science have called is tacit knowledge. And in the midst of this culture of the female brewster, we see the rise of the image of the alewife. Here's a picture of the alewife. With this expansion of this domestic industry and the selling of the surplus that's made at home, we have the first real sort of domestic economy that expands into an economy of exchange. And the brewing of beer by female brewsters and dished out, I guess, in the taverns and pubs of the medieval period become a major source of economy, run by women on craft tradition and with craft knowledge. Now, this very association of alcohol and craft and knowledge and independent economy and the alewife means that the alewife gets associated with these almost mystical practices of creating fermentation and unsavory business practices that are associated with it. And since they were often widows that were forced into the economy by the losing of a husband, they were associated with uncertain temptation and morals. And if you look on this slide, you notice this is the sign for the alewife hanging above the thing. Now, if we had question period right now, I'd ask you, what is that? It is a broom. a broom, a sweeping broom, and that's the sign of the tavern and the alewife.